The clock did not stop. The trains still ran, albeit on vastly reduced schedules, and the sun still rose over Manhattan. Yet for millions of Americans on the morning of October 30th, 1929, for the excruciating decade that followed, the world had ended. It's not on fire, but in silence. The silence of the factory floor, the silence of the foreclosed home, and the crushing silence of the national will. This wasn't merely a crisis. It was the chilling realization that the bedrock assumption of American life, perpetual progress and stability, had not just been shaken, but violently fractured. This narrative is an exploration of that fracture. It is the story of how America, a nation founded on a brittle parchment and a contested ideal, survived moments when the entire system, the economy, the social compact, the very structure of governance, threatened to unravel entirely. To understand how to prepare for future disasters, we must first learn to distinguish between a temporary setback and a genuine systemic collapse. A system in distress is not the same as a system that is failing. Most of the calamities we experience are what we call short-term crises. Events like hurricanes, localized pandemics, or the abrupt shutdown of a single financial institution. These crises are characterized by high intensity and short duration. They interrupt function, they cause immense damage. But the core governmental, economic, and infrastructure systems remain intact and are rapidly mobilized for recovery. The post-disaster playbook is known. FEMA arrives, insurance pays out, and the power grid is rebuilt within weeks. The underlying national framework is never questioned. But history shows us moments of true existential collapse. These are characterized by the failure of structure itself, lasting for years or even decades. We look back at the Civil War, 1861, 1865, see the catastrophic failure of the political structure, where the fundamental contract between states dissolved into bloodshed. We study the Great Depression, 1929 to 1941, and witness the failure of the economic structure, where the market ceased to function as a reliable mechanism for distributing resources, leading to mass starvation amidst potential plenty. In these moments, the established rules, the Constitution, the gold standard, the inviolability of private banks, became objects of desperate negotiation or outright rejection. These events were not accidents. They were a complete loss of national faith in the operating system. The greatest lesson we can draw from these dark chapters is unfound in economic charts or legislative acts, but in the subtle, profound shift in the national mindset. Resilience, at its most foundational level, is a psychological process that begins with the collective death of complacency. Before a collapse, a nation operates under the assumption of continuity. Everyone assumes the paycheck will clear, the lights will stay on, and the institutions will hold. Out! The mind is focused outward in acquisition, leisure, and future planning. When systemic failure occurs, the mind snaps inward. Into survival mode, this shift is characterized by three primal reactions. Loss of trust in the remote, faith evaporates in distant centralized authorities, Wall Street, the federal government, the global market. Attention immediately localizes, focusing only on the visible and the tangible. The family, the neighborhood, the small farm. Survival becomes a hyperlocal effort, radical adaptation. Old rules become obstacles. The businessman who once valued formality starts trading goods for services. The farmer who never talked politics is now organizing mutual aid networks. People shed inefficient peacetime habits and adopt the pragmatism of the frontier. adaptation is no longer a choice. It is a necessity driven by immediate visceral needs, a shared primal focus for all the polarization that might have existed beforehand. An existential threat forces a grim, shared objective: live to see tomorrow. This focus, even if born of fear, temporarily resets the social calculus, allowing for collaborative solutions that would have been politically impossible just months prior. To study American resilience is therefore to study this terrifying but powerful transformation the moment the nation recognized the shadow of the unthinkable, and in doing so found the blueprint for its own survival. The stories of recovery that follow were built upon this psychological foundation, transforming fear into furious, decentralized action. Well, if the Great Depression was the soundless collapse of the American economic dream, the Civil War was its loudest, most violent structural failure. On April 9, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the fighting ended, but the collapse was just beginning. The nation was left with nearly 750,000 dead, half its industrial base ravaged, and an entire social and labor system slavery annihilated, requiring a political and economic replacement overnight. The Union had won the war, but it faced a far more profound challenge. How do you reconstruct a political entity when the fundamental premise of its existence, the voluntary and perpetual union of states, has been proven mutable by 4 years of bloodshed? This was more than a crisis. It was the annihilation of the old national structure. The physical infrastructure, rail lines, plantations, communication links, was pulverized. But far more devastating was the collapse of the legal and social compact. The question facing Washington was existential. Were the secessionist states conquered territories, or were they merely states in rebellion? The answer determined the path to survival. With no historical parallel for recovery and no existing legal precedent for reunification after such a schism, the political instruments of survival had to be activated under the highest pressure. The most critical factor in America's recovery was the strange, quiet endurance of the Constitution of 1787, despite the South's creation of its own governmental framework. The original document remained the undisputed legal blueprint for the surviving Union. It was the dormant operating system that needed to be rebooted, patched, and radically updated, rather than replaced entirely. The framers, in their wisdom, had provided the most vital tool for systemic repair. Article 5, the amendment process. This seemingly simple mechanism for change proved to be the ultimate legal instrument of survival. It allowed the victorious government to enforce a new, unassailable legal reality onto the fractured nation. The recovery effort, therefore, was not one of invention, but of radical legal modification. The Reconstruction Congress immediately deployed what we can call the Reconstruction Code, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment, 1865, surgically removed the cancer of slavery, eliminating the entire legal and economic basis of the Confederacy. The 14th Amendment, 1868, was arguably the most monumental piece of systemic hardening in American history, defining national citizenship, guaranteeing due process, and mandating equal protection of the laws across all states. This single legal patch fundamentally redefined the relationship between the individual, the state, and the federal government, placing federal rights protection above state interference. Finally, the 15th Amendment, 1870, attempted, however imperfectly, to provide the franchise. The legal blueprint of the amendments required an equally radical political engine to enforce it across a defiant, defeated South. This era demonstrated that recovery from systemic collapse demands the temporary use of extraordinary centralized power to enforce the new structural reality. Congressional Reconstruction utilized military force to govern the former Confederacy, organizing it into 5 military districts. This was a necessary, though temporary, suspension of traditional peacetime norms. It highlighted a key lesson in systemic recovery. The rule of law, when broken by existential threat, must sometimes be physically enforced to be reestablished. The focus was reunification through legal and political supremacy, by making the new amendments non-negotiable prerequisites for readmission to the Union. The federal government legally hardwired the new national identity. The process was messy, violent, and ultimately incomplete, but it succeeded in its primary task, ensuring that the American political structure, though stretched to its breaking point, did not permanently shatter. The Constitution, refined by the furnace of war and codified through the Reconstruction Code, proved its worth not as a static historical artifact, but as a living, adaptable legal framework, the ultimate blueprint for survival. The political lesson is clear. When the national structure collapses, the only way to rebuild is through the radical enforcement of foundational, shared legal principles that redefine the social contract for the entire system. If the Civil War tested the American system's ability to remain physically whole, the Great Depression tested its capacity to remain economically viable. This was a crisis of confidence so profound that it rendered resources meaningless. Farmers burned crops to heat their homes while city dwellers starved. Factories sat idle, yet millions were desperate for manufactured goods. The machinery of capitalism, the system designed to link supply and demand through the invisible hand of the market, had seized up, creating a disaster of paradox and unprecedented scale. The collapse of 1929 to 1941 was not the result of an invading army or a catastrophic natural event. It was an internal hemorrhage of faith. When the stock market crashed, it wasn't just wealthy investors who lost paper fortunes. The subsequent bank failures, where 9,000 banks disappeared between 1930 and 1933, resulted in the total evaporation of savings for ordinary people. This represented the ultimate failure of institutional trust. The common American had been told to save diligently and trust the bank, only to find that the very institutions meant to secure their future were ephemeral, disappearing overnight and taking lifetimes of labor with them. The lesson of this era is that a nation cannot survive an economic collapse unless its governing body is willing to fundamentally redefine the social contract between the individual and the state. Prior to the New Deal, the prevailing philosophy of governance held that the market was a self-correcting force, and government interference was an undesirable intrusion. This adherence to laissez-faire economics proved to be a fatal flaw when faced with a systemic crisis. The system required liquidity, coordination, and a massive infusion of public trust, none of which could be provided by atomized private actors. In the face of catastrophic failure, the government's initial response, relying on voluntary cooperation and balanced budgets, was equivalent to applying a small bandage to a rupturing dam. The path to survival required a radical departure. The activation of centralized power, not to replace the market, but to inoculate it against self-destruction. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was the political instrument of this economic survival. The moment FDR declared a 4-day national bank holiday in March 1933, temporarily shutting down the entire financial system, was the moment the government formally assumed responsibility for the stability of the economy. This was a revolutionary act, demonstrating that when systemic collapse looms, the state must exert absolute centralized control to halt the downward spiral. The subsequent programs were an exercise in creating economic redundancy and social shock absorbers. The immediate goal was survival, putting millions to work via the civilian conservation Corps CCC and the Public Works Administration PWA to prevent social unrest and starvation. But the enduring legacy was the creation of permanent, structural safety nets designed to prevent a recurrence of the total collapse of institutional confidence. Two creations stand out as masterpieces of institutional resilience that permanently redefined the American collapse plan. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, 1933. The FDIC was a direct structural response to the erosion of trust. By guaranteeing individual bank deposits up to a certain amount, the government essentially eliminated the fear that drove bank runs. It didn't stop banks from failing, but it stopped the panic from becoming a systemic contagion. The FDIC introduced a mechanism of insurance and shared risk at the federal level, ensuring that local bank failures would not translate into national collapse. This legal instrument secured the trust that is the lifeblood of a capitalist economy. Social Security, 1935. The Social Security Act recognized that poverty and destitution caused by old age or unemployment were not moral failures of the individual, but structural risks inherent in the industrial economy. By creating a mandatory contributory system of old age insurance, unemployment insurance, and federal support for certain dependents, the government built a permanent, decentralized stabilizer. When economic downturns struck, these payments would flow immediately, providing liquidity and preventing a domino effect of poverty-induced collapses at the community level. This institutional resilience redefined the social contract, creating a baseline of economic security in exchange for citizenship. The lesson from the Great Crucible is profound. Survival from economic collapse requires a willingness to use the government, its full weight to implement structural changes that prioritize collective stability over abstract economic ideologies. The New Deal didn't merely recover the economy, it rebuilt the core institutions with redundancies, creating the safety nets that have cushioned nearly every financial shock the nation has faced since. The nature of collapse fundamentally changed on December 7, 1941. The crisis was no longer an internal fracture. Like the political schism of the 1860s or the economic decay of the 1930s, this was an external, violent blow that shattered the American illusion of distance and safety. Pearl Harbor was a shock that galvanized the nation, demanding a type of resilience previously unseen. Industrial and technological flexibility enacted at incomprehensible speed. The lesson of this era is that when faced with an immediate external existential threat, survival depends on the power of rapid, centralized mobilization, the instantaneous ability to convert an entire peacetime economy into a war machine. The response to Pearl Harbor was the final, triumphant answer to the structural questions raised by the Great Depression. Where the Depression required the government to shore up institutions from below, World War II required the government to aggressively direct and accelerate the nation's output from above. The speed of the industrial pivot remains a defining characteristic of American resilience. Automobile manufacturers, led by executives like Henry Ford, stopped producing cars and started producing bombers and tanks. The Ford Willow Run plant, initially designed for car assembly, was converted into a colossal assembly line for B-2 for Liberator bombers, producing 1 plane per hour at its peak. This was not mere productivity. It was redundancy of purpose. The vast industrial capacity built during peacetime, even if hobbled during the Depression, proved to be an emergency resource that could be instantly repurposed for defense. This mobilization was powered by the War Production Board WPB and other centralized agencies that coordinated raw materials, directed labor, and mandated production goals. In effect, the government temporarily suspended the mechanisms of the free market and substituted a planned economy dedicated solely to winning the war. This centralized coordination proved that industrial flexibility, the core ability to switch from consumer goods to war material, was the key to resisting an external military collapse. The true innovation of the World War II and Cold War eras, however, was the institutionalization of the partnership between government and industry. In the scientific community, a relationship famously later dubbed the military-industrial complex. This alliance was forged out of necessity, recognizing that the primary battlefield had moved from the factory floor to the laboratory. The challenge posed by Nazi Germany, and later the Soviet Union, was inherently technological. Survival meant not just producing more planes than the enemy, but producing fundamentally better and more powerful technologies. This led to the creation of megaprojects that represented a new, concentrated form of institutional resilience. The Manhattan Project was the ultimate expression of centralized, state-sponsored technological mobilization. It was a secret, multi-billion-dollar effort, a massive expenditure for the time managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, uniting physicists, engineers, and industrial partners across the country. Its goal was simple: to invent a weapon powerful enough to end the war before the enemy could do the same. This project demonstrated that when survival is at stake, the government can and must bypass traditional bureaucratic and market hurdles to invest boundless resources into higher-risk, higher-ed scientific endeavors. The success of the bomb was a testament to the nation's capacity to organize intellectual talent and industrial infrastructure simultaneously. Following the war, the existential threat morphed from a hot war to the sustained ideological, technological competition of the Cold War. The institutional response was NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, established in 1958. NASA became the peacetime equivalent of the Manhattan Project. Utilizing the same centralized funding and goals to mobilize industry and science, the race to the moon was not merely a scientific achievement. It was a decades-long exercise in institutional resilience, proving the government's capability to invest in long-term, non-commercial R&D to maintain national security and ideological supremacy. The enduring lesson from the era of external shocks is that technological flexibility is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite for survival. It requires the state to be the ultimate venture capitalist, capable of coordinating immense industrial resources with cutting-edge scientific innovation to neutralize threats that operate at the speed of light and the scale of the globe. The nation survived the external threats by proving it could adapt its industrial body and harness its intellectual mind faster than any adversary. The historical record of American resilience is often dominated by grand, centralized actions. Lincoln's executive power, Roosevelt's New Deal agencies, and the massive industrial mobilization of World War II. Yet, for millions of Americans, survival was not granted by an act of Congress or a government-guaranteed deposit slip. It was secured by the sheer necessity of local, self-organized action when the centralized systems, governmental and natural, simply failed to operate. The lesson drawn from regional environmental collapses is that the critical moment of survival often occurs before the national response arrives, demonstrating the critical role of decentralization and community cohesion. The scale of environmental devastation in the early 20th century provided a severe test of local sovereignty. When the system that collapses is the very earth or water that sustains life, infrastructure fails not due to war or finance, but due to being physically overwhelmed. In these moments, local networks become the only viable system of survival, acting as an indispensable redundancy layer to national infrastructure. The spring of 1927, the Mississippi River swelled to unprecedented levels, triggering one of the most destructive natural disasters in U.S. history. Over 27,000 square miles across 7 states were submerged. The disaster quickly exposed the limits of pre-Depression federal capacity and the fragility of engineered solutions. The federal levee system, designed to protect cities, became a liability when it failed, turning entire regions into a lawless inland sea. For the hundreds of thousands of displaced people, the initial survival was not dictated by Washington. It was dictated by local action, neighbors pulling neighbors from rooftops, makeshift rescue fleets organized by local businessmen with flatboats, and the rapid formation of relief camps organized by civic and religious groups. In these moments, the collapse of physical infrastructure, roads, communication lines, and levees forced a return to communal interdependence. The flood crisis also highlighted a painful truth about systemic resilience. It is often unequally distributed. In many areas, the relief was brutally segregated, and the centralized response, when it did arrive, led by Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, relied on controversial, coercive labor practices in the camps. The collapse, therefore, was not uniform. It was a failure of national coherence, making the internal cohesion of marginalized local communities the singular guarantor of survival. Perhaps the most potent demonstration of grassroots survival was the slow motion, grinding environmental collapse of the Dust Bowl throughout the 1930s. This crisis was unique because it involved the collapse of a regional ecosystem, turning once fertile land into barren dust that drove families into mass migration. The response required adaptation, not just rescue. As the land failed and debt mounted, the existing social fabric, churches, general stores, schools often dissolved. But it was in the crucible of this collapse that new, transient networks were forged. The archetypal figure of the time, the Okie, represented the mobile, decentralized unit of resilience. As families migrated west toward California, their survival depended entirely on mutual aid networks established along the migratory routes. These were informal, non-institutional arrangements, sharing spare tires, pooling money for gasoline, and relying on word of mouth for work and shelter. Their ability to survive was tied not to the government programs, which were often slow to reach the migrant population, but to their capacity for radical social flexibility, shedding material possessions, and prioritizing the health of the group. The Dust Bowl showed that when regional collapse makes an area uninhabitable, the survival strategy shifts from rebuilding a place to preserving the people. People themselves became the decentralized seed bank of culture and labor, waiting for a new environment to replant themselves. The enduring lesson from these environmental catastrophes is essential for any modern collapse plan. Centralized power provides the legal and economic architecture for structural recovery. But decentralized community action provides the immediate human survival capacity. A federal government can rebuild a levee system or create the CCC to plant trees and stabilize the soil, but it cannot arrive in the critical first. 48 hours to pull families from rising floodwaters or organize the spontaneous resource sharing needed to survive a dust storm. That power rests with the local networks. To survive collapse, a nation must cultivate not only powerful central institutions, but also the social capital and fierce local cohesion that ensure the center holds, even when the nation is physically broken. The historical evidence is clear. The most durable element of the American collapse plan is the collective will and localized organization of its citizenry. I've generated the draft for Chapter 5, which completes the historical overview section by balancing centralized and decentralized resilience strategies. The next planned chapter is 6. The Infrastructure of Endurance. Policy Lessons that Hardened the Nation. Would you like to proceed with that draft? The first 5 chapters established a powerful, if messy, truths. America survives. Systemic collapse through a dynamic interplay of centralized intervention and decentralized community action, but survival is only half the equation. True resilience is not merely the ability to bounce back. It is the capacity to build better defenses after every disaster. The defining lesson of the mid-20th century is that resilience is not just a reaction, but the permanent architecture, the durable policies, institutions, and physical systems erected in the calm after the storm. When the immediate crisis passes, when the Civil War ends, the banks reopen, or the Dust Bowl lifts, the opportunity arises to implement systemic hardening. This transformation is driven by a deep collective realization. The previous status quo was insufficient. This chapter synthesizes the durable legacy of past crises, illustrating how these moments of near failure became the catalyst for building the resilient republic we know today. One of the most consequential pieces of enduring infrastructure born from a collapse mindset was the interstate highway system. While officially enacted in 1956 under the Federal Aid Highway Act, the foundational concept was steeped in Cold War paranoia and World War II logistics. The explicit justification was military. The system was designed to allow for the rapid deployment of troops and materiel across the country, and more chillingly, for the mass evacuation of cities in the event of nuclear attack. The interstates were fundamentally an exercise in national redundancy, ensuring that vital supply lines could never be bottlenecked by localized rail failures or poorly maintained state roads. It was a tangible, colossal admission that decentralized transport could not handle a national emergency. Today, the system is used primarily for commerce and travel, but its hidden function remains its role as a strategic military and disaster logistics backbone, a monument to the mobilization. Lessons learned during the war. Past crises also revealed the lethal fragility of the American human condition. The uncontrolled disease outbreaks during the Civil War and the mass starvation and tuberculosis spread during the Depression and dust Bull made it clear that a resilient nation requires resilient citizens. The legacy here is a dramatic expansion of public health institutions and environmental protections. The New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, was on just about putting young men to work. It was a massive, decentralized effort in ecosystem stabilization. The CCC planted billions of trees to prevent soil erosion, addressing the root cause of the Dust Bowl, built reservoirs, and improved national forests. This work established a precedent. Environmental stewardship is not a luxury, but a core component of national economic stability. Furthermore, the need to manage relief, disease, and nutritional deficiencies during the Depression accelerated the expansion of local and state public health departments. This infrastructure, often quietly funded by federal initiatives, became the foundation for standardized sanitation, immunization programs, and disease surveillance, structural defense mechanism against the kind of widespread plagues that once decimated populations. Perhaps the most unexpected element of post-collapse architecture is the codification of leisure and psychological relief. While not directly saving lives, the expansion and federal management of the national park system, especially under New Deal programs, contributed to national endurance. These parks were framed as vital assets places for public works, yes, but also sanctuaries for the national spirit. In a psychological sense, these protected lands provided a national memory bank of natural continuity, reminding a fearful, mobilized populace of the vast, unchanging territory they were fighting to preserve. By defining certain spaces as off-limits to exploitation and dedicating federal resources to their maintenance, these policies built institutional resilience into the very landscape, ensuring the nation's psychic recovery by preserving shared, non-commercial public space. The lessons from the Civil War yielded the 14th Amendment legal architecture. The Depression yielded the FDIC and Social Security economic architecture. World War II and the Cold War yielded the interstate highway system and NASA logistical and technological architecture. The core thesis is thus validated. Resilience is not a single act of heroism, but a multi-decade process of translating painful systemic failure into permanent institutional hardening. These policies spanning physical infrastructure, economic regulation, and environmental management are the silent, durable evidence of America's past near-collapse events. They represent the cumulative pragmatic wisdom extracted from the shadow of the unthinkable, proving that the greatest moments of national construction often follow the greatest moments of national destruction. The resilient structures forged in the fire of the 20th century, the FDIC, the interstate highways, Social Security, were built on the principle of redundancy. They were the institutional spare tires designed to absorb political, economic, or physical shocks. Yet, in the modern age, the pursuit of efficiency has become the guiding ideology, inadvertently transforming these robust systems into a new kind of fragility. The 21st century has introduced systemic vulnerabilities unknown to our ancestors, where strength is derived from connection, but catastrophe is spread by it. This chapter marks the pivot from history to prognosis. We must now analyze the new vices, the systemic fragilities baked into the fabric of modern life that threaten a collapse of unparalleled speed and complexity. The core modern risk is not a single point of failure, but the cascading interdependence that turns a local setback into a global catastrophe. The signature innovation of global capitalism since the Cold War has been hyperglobalization and the adoption of just-in-time JIT manufacturing and logistics. JIT, or lean manufacturing, is a philosophy that views inventory as waste. Goods, components, and raw materials are delivered to factories and stores precisely when they are needed, minimizing costly storage and maximizing profit. This system, while financially efficient, is the antithesis of resilience. The lessons of industrial mobilization during World War II Chapter 4 emphasize building massive stockpiles and redundant production lines. JIT eliminates this strategic slack, replacing resilience with speed. As a result, the entire global economy operates with near-zero buffer capacity. The COVID-19 pandemic offered a stark, real-time demonstration of this fragility. A localized virus outbreak in Wuhan, China, rapidly led to the collapse of global supply chains for everything from medical personal protective equipment, PPE, to microchips for cars. This single shock exploited the systemic brittleness because there was no redundancy, no stockpiled masks, no excess chip manufacturing capacity. A failure in one node immediately translated into paralysis everywhere else. A modern disruption doesn't just halt a single factory. It halts all factories that rely on that single, distant component. This structural dependence makes the modern economy exquisitely vulnerable to minor disruptions that spiral into major collapse.
Wow.
While the Civil War saw a total physical fracture, the modern political landscape presents a different, more insidious threat: institutional paralysis driven by extreme political polarization. Past crises, particularly the Depression and the Cold War, were survived because a collective sense of existential threat allowed for rapid bipartisan consensus on radical action: the New Deal, the interstate system, NASA. These centralized acts of resilience required a functional center capable of mobilizing national will. Today's hyper-partisan environment makes such mobilization nearly impossible. Political competition is no longer seen as a debate over policy, but a zero-sum war for cultural dominance. The result is a system perpetually locked in a stalemate, incapable of making the difficult. Long-term infrastructural investments necessary to harden the nation against foreseeable collapse risks, for example, climate change mitigation, modernizing the power grid, cyber defense. This polarization acts as a social feedback loop magnified by digital media. It erodes the fundamental trust required for collective action. When a crisis hits, the public consensus fractures immediately. Is the threat real? Is the government response legitimate? The psychological shift into survival mode Chapter 1 now occurs not into shared action, but into competing, distrustful camps, preventing the coordinated national response that saved the nation during the 1930s. The danger is not that the government will be overthrown, but that it will be incapacitated by internal division when it is needed most. The final defining modern vulnerability is speed. Past collapses, even the rapid market crash of 1929, unfolded over weeks, months, and years. Modern collapse scenarios, whether financial, viral, or digital, can occur in days, hours, or even milliseconds, propagated through instantaneous global networks. The speed of information, trade, and even biological contagion has been optimized for flow, meaning the time window for a centralized, measured response is vanishingly small.
Wow.
This fragility is a direct trade-off for convenience. We have optimized our lives for comfort and instant access, sacrificing the structural slack that once served as a life raft. The coming challenges will test whether a nation that has prized efficiency above all else can relearn the forgotten wisdom of strategic redundancy, the essential and often costly slack required for true survival. This question is most urgently applied to our most critical and complex dependency, the digital realm. The historical lessons of resilience, the legal blueprints of the 14th Amendment, the financial safety nets of the FDIC, and the industrial capacity of the WPBL share a common, comforting feature. They are physical and analog. They deal with tangible resources like land, factories, and currency. But today, the most catastrophic collapse scenario resides in a realm that is intangible. It's instantaneous and operates entirely without a physical safety net, the digital infrastructure. The digital fault line represents the single most disruptive modern threat, threatening a collapse scenario that is fundamentally different from any disaster in American history. The threat is not merely a loss of convenience, but the systemic paralysis of society. Modern life is not just digitized. It is digitally predicated. Every function of the durable republic is now routed through a delicate stack of fiber optic cables, GPS satellites, and time-synchronizing servers. A common and dangerous misconception is that the lessons of physical collapse apply directly to digital collapse. They do not. Consider the Great Depression, Chapter 3. When the banks failed in 1933, currency still existed. People could still trade gold, barter goods, and sign contracts written on paper. The economy had an analog undercurrent that allowed basic transactions to continue while the institutional structure was rebooted. Even during the Civil War, communication telegraph rail was slowed, but never instantaneously eliminated across the whole system. A large-scale digital blackout caused by a sophisticated, coordinated cyber attack. A solar flare, a Carrington event, or a widespread software failure would eliminate the entire transactional basis of the modern economy in a single, visible instant. In this scenario, finance. Money ceases to be a functional medium. Credit cards, ATMs, stock markets, and bank balances are instantly inaccessible. The FDIC is functionally useless if the server containing your account balance cannot be read. Logistics. The just-in-time JIT system, Chapter 7, instantly halts. Not because a truck broke down, but because GPS signals fail, shipping containers cannot be tracked, and railway signaling systems go dark. Food distribution, which relies entirely on digital routing, would seize up within 48 hours. Power grid, energy delivery systems rely on networked sensors, remote controls, and precise timing signals often derived from GPS. A failure of the network can lead to controlled shutdowns, or, worse, uncontrolled physical damage to transformers and generation stations. The primary contrast is simple. Previous collapses left behind analog wreckage that could be repurposed. Collapse leaves behind physical infrastructure that cannot be operated because the control system is gone. The defining characteristic of the digital fault line is the speed of collapse. A financial panic in 1929 took weeks to cascade across the nation through newspapers and telegrams. A modern financial collapse, such as the flash crashes that occur frequently, happens in milliseconds. If a single systemic vulnerability, a zero-day exploit in widely used industrial control software, for example, is leveraged, the failure can propagate globally faster than any human operator can detect, let alone respond to. This speed eliminates the essential window of centralized mobilization that saved the nation in previous eras. By the time a president could convene a cabinet, the crisis might already be past the point of no return. Furthermore, the complexity is opaque. Unlike a bank failure, which is easily understood as a withdrawal of cash, a digital failure is invisible and inscrutable. It's nearly impossible for leaders or the public to distinguish between a hardware malfunction, a foreign military attack, or a simple software bug. This opacity feeds into the political polarization, Chapter 7, immediately creating deep mistrust in the official narrative and paralyzing any coordinated recovery effort. The lesson of the Civil War was that the Constitution provided the legal blueprint for reunification. The lesson of the digital fault line is that we have no such equivalent blueprint for recovering the data-driven core of modern society. Our dependence on digital systems is total, but our structural redundancy is zero. Survival in the age of the digital fault line requires a radical new kind of resilience, the creation of durable, accessible, non-digital backups for core systemic functions. We must start treating our critical infrastructure as if it operates without a connection to the digital world, designing electrical grids with local analog circuit breakers, acquiring paper-based backup systems for medical records, and training local communities to operate without networked communications. Until that happens, the American system remains optimized for the comfort of continuity, sacrificing strategic security for ephemeral convenience, leaving the entire apparatus hostage to a single, invisible line of code. The analysis of the digital fault line, Chapter 8, leads to a stark conclusion. The speed and complexity of modern systemic shocks, whether digital, viral, or logistical, will always outpace the response time of centralized government. The great structures built in the 20th century, like the interstate highway system and FEM, are designed for the recovery phase, but recovery cannot begin until the immediate shock is absorbed. The primary responsibility for bridging the critical time gap between initial collapse and centralized mobilization rests, therefore, with the decentralized defense, the local networks, neighborhoods, and non-governmental entities that become the nation's first responders. In a crisis defined by milliseconds and instantaneous viral spread, survival is measured in the minutes, hours, and first days of improvisation. The enduring lesson is clear: national mobilization requires time. Grassroots, localized, and non-governmental efforts provide the critical response time in a crisis. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 were a physical and infrastructural shock that instantly paralyzed the conventional response structure of the nation's largest city. Within minutes, air traffic was grounded, bridges and tunnels were closed, and lower Manhattan was cut off. Traditional centralized evacuation and rescue protocols were rendered useless by the scale and shock of the event. In the ensuing chaos, the true decentralized defense mechanism of the city activated. It wasn't the Coast Guard, though they played a role, but a vast, spontaneous fleet of civilian vessels, ferry operators, tugboat captains, and pleasure craft owners who spontaneously converged on the seawalls of Manhattan. In what became the largest sea evacuation in history, over 500,000 people were ferried out of the danger zone. This was a pure example of local sovereignty, Chapter 5 applied to a modern catastrophe. These decentralized actors, operating without orders and relying on local knowledge and professional instinct, provided the necessary redundancy when the government's transport and command systems were incapable of functioning. They acted in the essential window before the slow, grinding machinery of federal aid could be properly coordinated. If 9/11's demonstrated rapid success in the decentralized response, Hurricane Katrina 2005 starkly illustrated the catastrophic consequences of institutional paralysis when local, state, and federal coordination failed simultaneously. The physical failure was the breaching of the levees, a recurring flaw from Chapter 5. But the true collapse was the failure of preparedness and the subsequent time lag in centralized aid. For days, tens of thousands of citizens were stranded without food, water, or medical care. In this vacuum of institutional authority, local networks once again asserted themselves. The Cajun Navy, an entirely non-governmental improvised fleet of ordinary boat owners from across the Gulf South mobilized, navigating the flooded streets to rescue victims. These were neighbors helping neighbors, relying on pre-existing social capital and private equipment. Katrina demonstrated that the national safety net is only as effective as the local, on-the-ground capability to deliver that aid. When bureaucracy breaks, the only functioning system left is the social system, the decentralized bonds of community. This case study confirms that for a physical collapse of this magnitude, the delay in federal response is guaranteed. And the local network is the difference between life and death. The initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic provided a perfect, slow-motion demonstration of the systemic fragilities identified. In Chapter 7, Just-in-Time Supply Chains and Institutional Paralysis, as the federal government struggled with testing, messaging, and procuring essential personal protective equipment, PPE, hospitals, schools, and local communities were left to fend for themselves. The local resilience mechanism activated through localized resource sharing and substitute manufacturing. Home sewers organized to produce cloth masks. Local distilleries pivoted to making hand sanitizer. And mutual aid groups organized decentralized food banks and check-in systems for the elderly. This bottom-up mobilization was a direct response to the failure of centralized logistics, a failure of the modern optimized supply chain. Local communities, drawing on their immediate human and material assets, created the necessary slack that the hyper-efficient global system had eliminated. The synthesis of these modern shocks leads to the 48-hour imperative. The first 2 days following any major systemic shock are the most dangerous. During this period, communications, transportation, and political coordination will be at their lowest point of function. The decentralized defense local groups, nonprofits, neighbors, and citizen volunteers must be prepared to function as a fully autonomous survival system during this critical window. They are the surge protectors of the nation, absorbing the initial wave of chaos until the massive, slower-moving apparatus of the durable republic, the government, the military, the interstate system can finally align and respond. Strengthening these local networks is not a romantic ideal. It is a hard, pragmatic requirement for modern survival. We have traveled from the political fracture of the Civil War to the economic shock of the Great Depression, through the mobilization of World War II, and into the hyper-vulnerable landscape of the digital age. In every collapse scenario, the pattern of recovery is consistent: an initial shock, a decentralized improvisation period, and a final systemic hardening. And the greatest challenge for modern resilience is not fighting the last war, but synthesizing past wisdom into a doctrine fit for future, faster crises. The architecture of endurance is not a blueprint for what to build, but a set of principles for how to think. This chapter extracts 5 core, actionable lessons from the historical record, creating a future-proof survival doctrine for the durable republic. The defining tension of the modern era is the aggressive pursuit of efficiency, Chapter 7, at the cost of redundancy. This vice is what makes the just-in-time supply chain exquisitely fragile. Resilience, by its nature, is costly, wasteful, and slow qualities modern systems try to eliminate. Past lesson: the industrial pivot during World War II Chapter 4 required massive, redundant production capacity, Willow Run, and immense stockpiles of materials. The FDIC Chapter 3 is a costly, redundant financial cushion that prevents a bank run from becoming systemic collapse. Future doctrine: the system must intentionally design in strategic slack. This means moving key supply chains for medicine, microchips, and energy back to decentralized domestic control, regardless of marginal cost increases. It means accepting that storing extra physical inventory, maintaining analog backups for digital systems, Chapter 8, and having idle capacity in critical infrastructure is not wasted, is insurance. Collapse renders established rules and rigid ideologies useless, Chapter 1. The ability to shed dogma and embrace radical pragmatism is the true measure of survival capacity. Past lesson: when the Constitution failed in 1861, Lincoln used executive adaptation to preserve the Union. When laissez-faire economics failed in 1933, FDR abandoned it for massive state intervention, Chapter 3. The Okies of the Dust Bowl, Chapter 5, survived not by following rules, but by abandoning their land and forming transient, flexible mutual aid networks. Future doctrine: resilience requires institutional fluidity. Government agencies, corporations, communities must have prevented protocols for role reversal, for example. Hospitals acting as temporary triage centers, or breweries converting to sanitizer production. The goal is to train not for a specific disaster, but for the capacity to improvise when the standard playbook inevitably fails. Centralized national mobilization, even at its most rapid World War II, takes days or weeks to deploy resources. Modern shocks, especially digital and viral, take minutes or hours. The critical survival window is the first 48 hours, and only decentralized local networks can fill that gap. Past lesson: the boat lift on 9/11s and the Cajun Navy during Katrina, Chapter 9, demonstrate that when centralized command and control fails, the community's social capital is the only functioning operational asset. Future doctrine: treat local communities as the primary security perimeter. Invest in local social capital and skills, emergency food systems, neighborhood communication systems like ham radio or local mesh networks as analog backups, and decentralized utility microgrids. The goal is to empower every local network to be a fully autonomous survival unit for the first 48 to 72 hours, absorbing the initial shock before the federal safety net arrives. A collapse is also a crisis of trust, Chapter 1. Recovery is impossible without restoring faith in the system's fairness and durability. This requires enforcing new contracts legal and creating shared symbols of continuity. Psychological. Past lesson: the 14th Amendment, Chapter 2, fundamentally recalibrated the legal compact, making the Union stronger and fairer in principle. The establishment of the National Park System, Chapter 6, provided a powerful psychological anchor, a tangible, enduring piece of the nation that remained untouched by economic or political turmoil. Future doctrine: any response to a major collapse must include an immediate plan for legal reform that addresses the root cause of the failure. More critically, leaders must intentionally create shared national projects, public works, infrastructure modernization, or even shared digital security standards that transcend partisan lines and remind a polarized population that they are fighting for a common, tangible future. True resilience is not found in the immediate reaction, but in the long-term, expensive, and often politically unpopular architecture built after the crisis has passed. Chapter 6. This is the infrastructure of endurance. Past lesson, the interstate highway system. Chapter 6 was a permanent logistical hardening justified by military necessity, but benefiting commerce for decades. Social Security. Chapter 3 was a permanent tax and transfer system built specifically to prevent future economic collapses from creating mass destitution. Future doctrine. The nation must prioritize unseen investments in hardening the critical infrastructure that underpins modern life. This means fortifying the electrical grid against cyber threats and solar flares, investing in regional water storage to withstand climate shocks, establishing permanent, federally mandated minimum stockpiles for essential materials. These investments should be viewed not as governmental spending, but as strategic, non-commercial defense, the durable shell of the republic. These 5 principles, redundancy, adaptation, local sovereignty, recalibration, and hardening, form the basis of a proactive survival plan. They represent the distilled wisdom of America's near-death experiences, urging us to shift our focus from maximizing speed and profit to ensuring stability and survival. The journey from the Civil War to the digital age has revealed that resilience is not a natural state, but a manufactured capability and infrastructure of endurance built through painful lessons. To survive the rapid, complex shocks of the 21st century, we must move beyond the 5 survival principles and translate them into concrete, actionable policies and projects. Architecting the durable republic requires a fundamental shift in investment, prioritizing strategic defense over short-term financial optimization. This blueprint focuses on 3 interconnected areas necessary for societal hardening: policy, infrastructure, and education. The core purpose of modern policy must be to reintroduce redundancy principle 1 into systems that have become perilously efficient. Policy must mandate the domestic production and stockpiling of critical materials required for immediate national survival. This means aggressive tax incentives and direct federal investment to create redundant manufacturing capacity for essential pharmaceuticals, APIs, ending dependence on single foreign sources for basic drug ingredients, semiconductor fabrication, ensuring sovereign, domestic capability to produce foundational microchips that run the power grid and financial systems. Chapter 8. Emergency PPE. Maintaining permanent, distributed national stockpiles of medical equipment exceeding just-in-time inventory levels. 2. Reinforce local sovereignty. Principle 3 against logistical collapse. Chapter 7. The government should launch a massive grant program targeted at local and regional food systems. Goal: reduce reliance on the long-haul, centralized distribution system. Action: fund urban farming initiatives, regional cold storage facilities, community land trusts for agricultural use, and local butcher processing facilities. This builds immediate, localized food security capable of sustaining a community during the 48-hour imperative. Implement mandatory, federally audited analog backup requirements for all critical infrastructure. Principle 1 in Chapter 8. This requires utilities, hospitals, and financial clearinghouses to maintain and regularly test non-digital operational protocols that can function for at least 72 hours without internet access, GPS, or centralized network synchronization. Hardening the physical and digital architecture is the most expensive, yet most essential, implementation of the unseen investment principle 5. The massive, interconnected national power grid is a single, tempting target for cyber and physical attacks. The solution is decentralization. Action. Prioritize federal funding and streamline permitting for the creation of local utility microgrids. MAL. Localized energy systems powered by solar, wind, or natural gas that can intentionally island themselves from the main grid during a failure event. This maintains power for hospitals, water treatment plants, and emergency centers, upholding local sovereignty and allowing neighboring communities to function autonomously. The internet relies on fragile, easily disrupted choke points. We must build a dark fiber national network, redundant fiber optic lines owned, controlled and protected by the government, like the interstate system. Chapter 6. Function. This network would operate separately from the public internet, reserved for emergency government, military, and critical infrastructure communication. In the event of a total digital blackout, Chapter 8, this would provide a resilient, secure backbone for coordinating national response and legal and psychological recalibration principle for in regions prone to climate change-induced drought or flood. Water security requires the adaptation over rigidity principle. Action. Invest in large-scale regional water storage reservoirs, aquifer recharge, and build redundant pipeline connections between major metropolitan areas to allow for fluid redirection of water resources during regional shortages. Hardening infrastructure is useless if the human element fails due to panic or disbelief. Education must serve as the mechanism for adaptation principle 2 and fostering trust principle 4. A modern collapse is often preceded by a collapse of truth. Chapter 7. Polarization. Action. Integrate practical media literacy and critical thinking courses into all levels of education. The goal is to train citizens to recognize and resist disinformation cascades during a crisis, ensuring that the necessary consensus for collective action can form. To reinforce the 48-hour imperative, we must teach practical self-sufficiency. Action. Launch a modern, decentralized version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, Chapter 6. This program would train youth and adults in essential analog skills: emergency radio communication, ham radio operation, basic first aid, water purification, and localized food preservation. This shifts the cultural narrative from passive dependence on centralized government to active, skilled local participation and survival. Re-establishing a sense of shared common purpose is the only antidote to hyperpolarization. Action. Create a flexible, mandatory national service compact, civilian or military, for all citizens aged 18 to 25. This service would prioritize resilience, projects building microgrids, staffing disaster relief agencies, or performing environmental conservation work. This creates a shared national experience and forges the social capital necessary to unify the nation during the inevitable moments of collapse. This blueprint is an admission that the age of fragile efficiency must end. It calls for a return to the pragmatic, adaptive wisdom of our forebears, translating their historical struggle into a permanent, hardened foundation for the durable republic. We began this journey by defining the shadow of the unthinkable, those moments when the American system nearly fractured entirely, we traveled through the physical collapses of the Civil War and the Dust Bowl, the economic failures of the Great Depression, the rapid mobilization of World War II, and finally arrived at the cold, vulnerable landscape of the digital age. We analyzed the failures of just-in-time logistics and the speed of digital contagion, and we extracted a clear blueprint for societal hardening. But the most profound lesson is not found in the policies we enact or the infrastructure we build. The ultimate wisdom drawn from America's history of near-death experiences is that resilience is not a goal to be achieved, but a continuous, active process and endless rehearsal. The human mind craves finality. We want a collapse plan that, once executed, guarantees that the system will never fail again. We want the interstate highway system, Chapter 6, to be the final word in logistics, the FDIC Chapter 3, to be the final word in financial stability, and the Digital Immunity Act, Chapter 11, to be the final word in cyber defense. History denies us this comfort. Every successful recovery has merely introduced a new set of vulnerabilities. The 14th Amendment made the Union stronger, but led to new political conflicts. The efficiency required to win World War II led to the hyper-efficiency of just-in-time Chapter 7, making us brittle. The hardening built for yesterday's crisis becomes the rigidity that must be adapted or overcome for tomorrow's. The central paradox of endurance is this: you can never eliminate risk. You can only trade one vulnerability for another. To survive, we must accept that we live in the shadow of tomorrow's crisis. Survival is not measured by the absence of failure, but by the speed and ingenuity of the response. The durable republic is not a finished piece of architecture. It is a permanent construction site. When we view resilience as a verb, as an action, the 5 principles of survival shift from theoretical ideals to daily obligations. The endless rehearsal means continually practicing adaptation over rigidity, principle 2. It means not waiting for the next pandemic to teach us that we need redundancy over efficiency, principle 1. But constantly asking where our vital supply chains are unnecessarily brittle. It is the community-level work of strengthening local sovereignty, principle 3. Ensuring that every neighborhood is capable of meeting the 48-hour imperative, Chapter 9. This is why the blueprint emphasized the education, Chapter 11. Training citizens in practical self-sufficiency and critical thinking is the essential defense against both physical and informational collapse. A prepared citizenry is the ultimate shock absorber. If the social contract fails due to distrust, Chapter 7, the skills learned in a community resilience training program, Chapter 11, become the immediate source of authority, knowledge, and shared purpose. The investment in continuity, ultimately, the most important lesson from America's history of collapse, is about continuity. What saved the nation in 1865 was the enduring faith in the Constitution as a blueprint, Chapter 2. What saved it in 1933 was the trust that the government would, however reluctantly, step in to save the people. The greatest investment we can make in the durable republic is the non-material one. The investment in shared trust and common citizenship. When a society loses faith in its institutions, its fellow citizens, and its future, the political and economic systems become meaningless. The Mandatory National Service Compact, Chapter 11, is not simply a manpower program. It is an effort to rebuild the social capital and shared experience that unites a polarized nation under a common, nonpartisan objective. It forces people to practice the collective action necessary for survival before a crisis demands it. The American experience is not a saga of perfect planning, but a testament to the power of pragmatic, messy adaptation. We are a nation that learns by breaking. We have survived political fracture by creating legal tools, economic collapse by creating safety nets, and industrial threats by creating technological alliances. The crisis of tomorrow, whether a digital blackout or an accelerating climate event, is already casting its shadow. We cannot prevent the shadow from falling, but we can ensure that when it does, the foundation of the durable republic is hardened. The systems have slack, and the citizenry is prepared to execute the endless rehearsal, the active, evolving work of survival once more. The American idea of resilience is simply the commitment to endure, no matter the cost, and to be stronger on the other side.